I'm Lennox.
And I'm Moose.
And we are
Unapologetic.
Alright, well, we're back for another round. And today's a really special day because we're joined by the one and only, the phenomenal, the guy who ages a miraculous Tim Challies. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, glad to be here.
It's great to have you here.
And usually when I'm on a podcast and I say glad to be here, I mean, I'm sitting in my basement office and I'm talking on the phone, but I'm actually
You're
here.
actually
Exactly.
Absolutely.
How many miles do you think it is?
Yeah.
13,364 kilometers. I just looked it up on Find Friends to see how far my family is away from me.
That is crazy.
Yeah, that's,
You've
wow.
come a long way. And how many times have you been here?
Been to Zambia twice.
Okay.
My second time.
Okay, that's pretty awesome. Crazy story, Tim. So, my dad met you in Mozambique.
Oh, really?
I think earlier this year.
Yeah, in July.
That's right. I think that was in July.
Alright.
I've known the Woodrows for a long time. I love that film. I don't know if you produced it, but it was it was awesome. It was
Oh, good.
absolutely amazing.
Good.
Um,
Your dad was preaching there. I'm
yeah, he was
assuming.
preaching.
Alright,
Yeah,
cool.
absolutely. Good. So yeah, Tim. I mean, it's great to have people like you on the show. Great minds who've done so much for Christianity, for Christ. And hoping to learn as much as we possibly can from you today.
Great.
Just want to start with, how are you? How have you been?
Yeah, I'm doing all right.
Yeah.
Glad to be here. Lots
good.
of travel to get here. It's been a year of much travel.
Yeah.
And this is the last trip of the year, which is nice.
Wow,
Be getting back to my family. No, things are pretty good.
That's
It's
pretty
been,
awesome.
I've been enjoying the Lord's grace for the last little while.
That's pretty good. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
So maybe we can start actually with, just in case our audience doesn't know much about you, maybe you could just start with giving us the 2-minute summary of who Tim Challies
Sure.
is.
So when people ask what do, I say I'm a writer. It's kind of a vague term. I write books, but primarily I have a blog. That's kind of the main thing I've been doing for these years. I started that about 17, 18 years ago and started doing it on a daily basis 16 years ago. And I've been doing it ever since. That's kind of how I get known in places like Zambia. Wherever people read the English language, there's people reading the site, which is really neat. Gives lots of invitations to go and visit those people. And I've written a few books, and I'm also an elder, formerly an on-staff pastor, now an elder at Grace Fellowship Church in Toronto.
Okay. Yeah, so Tim, tell us a bit about how you met your wife.
Sure.
And just what that looked like.
Yeah. So 12th grade, I started in a new high school and met her there. First day of class, I walked in and we started chatting and had a good time and enjoyed one another all through that year. But nothing happened. We were just friends. But then at the end of that year, I left the school to go to university. She had another year left, and so we didn't talk for a whole year. And then after a year, out of the blue, she called me up, and it was funny, she called the house phone, and my sister answered it, my little sister, and she heard that it was a girl. Girls never called me for any reason, and she just started giggling, handed it to me, and said, "Hey Tim, it's your girlfriend," which was awkward.
Yeah.
But we started chatting, and she just said, "I wanted to call and ask about McMaster University. You've been going there, and I'd like to know about it." And I said, "Well, that's weird, because your dad's been there for 30 years. He could probably answer your questions."
Yeah.
It turns out she actually wanted to ask me to go to a dance with her,
Wow.
which is, I don't know. My mom said, "Isn't that a little bit forward?" I said no. But anyways, we ended up talking again and started just hitting it off. And eventually I just told her, "I'm a Christian, you're not a Christian, and I can only date somebody who's a Christian." And so she started asking about Christianity, and actually my mom took her out for breakfast one day and shared the gospel with her, and she right away believed in the gospel and put her faith in the Lord. And we got married a couple years later and have been married now for 21 years.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's pretty awesome. That's amazing.
Absolutely.
Now, our church is extremely multicultural. We've got people from all over the world. When people hear that story, some people are utterly scandalized by the fact that this girl would call me up.
Yeah.
In some places, it's like totally normal.
Sure.
In other places, it's like, how dare she do something like that?
That's really
It's probably a bit of a mix here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It happens.
So Tim, you've got 3 kids.
I do.
And I think you have been talking about this for a little while. But even more recently, you put out another article about sleepovers.
Yeah.
And basically, you don't allow your kids to do sleepovers. So just tell us a bit about that. Why don't you allow your kids to do sleepovers? Is it something that you'd recommend more parents to think of doing?
Maybe you guys can help me contextually.
Sure.
Sleepovers in Zambia, is that
It
a
happens.
thing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's,
sure.
it's actually not, I don't even think people have thought to think about it.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
something that
Yeah.
happens.
And outside family, so a friend will go to a friend's house and say,
Absolutely.
yeah, interesting, because one thing I learned from writing that article, in some places in the world, it was a very pressing issue.
Hmm.
In other places in the world, not an issue. You just don't do it. It's not part of the culture. So interesting to me that in Zambia it is part of the culture. So I wrote that because I had had some negative experiences with sleepovers as a child. Thankfully, nothing terrible happened, but just some negative situations. Aileen, much the same. And so when it came time to weigh that with our children, we just had some concerns about the vulnerability of being in somebody else's house at night, and usually in a situation where the parents aren't really aware, there may be other people in the house, and really a lot of the concern is older siblings. So you can send your little girl over to somebody else's house, and of course mom and dad are safe, and the girl's safe, but there's teenage boys in the house, and teenage boys do terrible things and ridiculous things, and so a lot of it was just uncertainty and fear of the unknown, and just wanting to protect our children. I didn't think it was that big a deal to make that decision, but after I wrote that article, it really did become a big deal. Nothing I've written has ever gotten as many views as that, like 7 or 8 million views or something on that article. So it's a huge, huge deal in people's minds. And I think a lot of it is just the fear of the unknown, and then also feeling like you're a bad parent if you don't let your children have this experience. So it was very interesting to write it and receive the mountains of feedback.
Wow, that's incredible. So is this something you wish more Christians would think about?
Yeah, I just want parents to think about it, and you can make the opposite decision. And there, I wouldn't ban all sleepovers. Our children will stay with my siblings, with their aunts and uncles, that kind of thing. So it's not a blanket. You may never sleep anywhere but in our house. I have grandparents. Well, I know my parents, and I know they raised me, and they did a fine job. So I'm comfortable with them and my family, of course. But I think parents really should be thinking about it and just reading some of the data, reading about some of the things that can happen. And then you just have to make a confident decision and go with it. And that's true in education, it's true in a lot of areas in the Christian life. You weigh the options before the Lord, you make a wise decision to the best of your understanding and knowledge, and you don't let other Christians judge you on that basis. You just remain confident.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, it's something I had never really considered until I read what you wrote about it, and it's the terrible instances that can come up from that. Maybe shifting gears a little bit. I think in your writing, one thing that I've noticed, and I think I'm still getting to know more of your writing, you seem to have a concern for the sort of state of young Christian men. What is your position on where Christian men are in relation to their faith, the environments or the sort of that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, I don't know that I can speak more broadly than my own context, so you'd have to answer that. Here in Zambia, I've traveled far and wide, and I just see different things all over. Maybe some of the recurring themes would be pornography being a huge challenge everywhere. Certain men in the church that men are gravitating toward, and even outside the church, so the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, I don't think can be disconnected from the way he's speaking to young men. As much as he resonates with some older men and some women, it's primarily, I think, young men. And there's other people who are reaching that demographic as well. And then there's some Christian men as well. So guys like Paul Washer, I think, really reaches Christian men. And Bodhi Bottom reaches Christian men in a special way. So, and then on the back of that, there's a weird phenomenon in sort of the early 2000s with that wild at heart kind of stuff. So that sort of almost, I don't know, that silly manhood stuff, manhood being about swinging swords and doing wild stuff. And so I think a lot of young men just don't know how to be men. And a lot don't have good male role models in their life, and there's just a lot of confusion. And then a lot of addiction. They get into bad stuff when they're young, and that really stunts their growth in manhood. The delay of marriage, the delay of children, all these things that seem to be pretty much universal are, I think, really impacting young Christian men.
Absolutely. But just leaning into that a little bit more, you've written quite a lot on pornography. And I remember several years ago you had done this 31-day purity challenge, and so pornography is definitely like a passion project for you. just in what ways have you seen pornography damage people? And what are some of the things that young men can do to fight against falling into this sin?
Yeah. So my interest in pornography and writing about that issue really came out of interacting with young men in my church. And to be frank, what occurred to me as I was talking to young men or hearing young men talk, it occurred to me one day that these young men were looking forward to getting married so they could act out pornography on somebody.
Yeah.
So they had seen millions or thousands of pornographic acts, but they had never actually been with a woman.
Sure.
So they were looking forward to marriage so they could finally act out all this stuff. And I just had this rage inside that these men would marry the sweet young women in our church, and then that was a big part of their interest, just being able to take out that kind of pornographic aggression.
Yeah.
So I wrote the book Sexual Detox first, just a series on my blog, and then turned it into a book, really trying to address young men. You need to stop this behavior. You're going to damage other people. You're going to damage yourself. And then trying to give them hope. You really can overcome this issue. Pornography does have a way of stunting men, and that can be true in many different levels. There's a lot of talk about the brain, how the brain changes with the constant stimulation. You could talk about the addictive qualities of pornography, some of which are mental, some of which are probably spiritual, some of which are on that chemical level.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on, but I just think my fear is it does become compulsive, that over time, that first thrill, I think we've all seen things in life or experienced things in life, and you get that wave of adrenaline, and that becomes contagious, and soon you find yourself going back again and again. And you talk to young Christian men, there's a good part of them that doesn't want to look at pornography, and yet time after time they go back to it. So even though they don't want to, they want to just a little bit more than they don't want to. And so trying to help guys understand what's going on, and again trying to give them hope that they can overcome this thing, but it will require a very deep change in their attitude, a deep change in their understanding of God and His grace through the gospel.
Absolutely. Okay, that's pretty cool.
I think there's a lot of hope when it comes to pornography. So the rise of pornography has obviously been carried by the internet, and as the internet goes farther across the world, pornography goes farther across the world. And so when I first started writing, I was writing for young men in North America.
Sure.
And then one day a guy got in touch in India, and it hadn't really occurred to me that this problem had spread around the world.
That's right.
But he said, I'm pastoring in India, and all my young men are hooked on porn. Can you come to India and talk about it? And since then I've spoken about it in many different places, and it was a surprise to me, but I guess just as devices got more widely available and internet access more widely available, more accessible, the problem has spread. The hope in the issue is that what my generation, we were raised by parents who had no idea what would happen if you gave young men, young women, computers, screens, internet. They just didn't understand that, like, of course, well, what else ever would have happened, right? We understand that now. If you give young men screens and internet access, they're going to look at porn. But my generation, now that we're raising sons, we understand that. And I'm not saying we're any better than our parents, we just understand this thing now. And so we're trying to raise our sons differently, trying to interact with them, engage with them, have conversations with them, put measures in place, covenant eyes, filters, all this stuff. So hopefully the next generation is being held back from some of that, at least.
Absolutely. That's fine.
Yeah, and it's obviously a really devastating issue, even here. How have you approached the idea that it's not? Maybe it's different in Canada, but here it's not particularly talked about. That this issue is prevalent amongst people, even in the church. Has it just been an encouragement to make this a staple of conversation for address, or has there been backlash? How has it been in your context?
I think it's talked about in Canada and North America. I think it's pretty widely accepted now that it's going on, and so pastors will make it a point of application in their sermons. Guys like myself, I'll talk to young men when I talk to them. I've got no problems asking when was the last time you looked at pornography, that kind of thing. Just part of parenting my son was to talk to him specifically about this. My wife engages with a lot of women who are addicted to pornography, so she has those conversations with them, and so it's pretty widely talked about. And I think some of those are cultural differences. There are some Indian cultures not really talked about, which is why I think they asked me to come in. It would be a little bit easier for me to come in and and speak to the context.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I just think a lot depends on, honestly, probably in honor-shame type cultures, it's maybe a little harder to talk about it than in a culture like in Canada.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so
but that's not to say you shouldn't talk about it. And you know, culturally there may be ways of doing that are more appropriate or less appropriate.
Yeah.
But when you read scripture, which is transcultural, Paul was really blatant with talking about sexuality. He was always appropriate, but I mean, he was talking about like specific roles within a homosexual relationship and saying this kind of person will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. So I think if pornography was as prevalent today, or as prevalent in his day as it was today, I think he would have spoken about it. He would have called out people and said, no viewer of pornography will inherit the kingdom of heaven. So I think we ought to speak about it, even if we had to do it in ways that are appropriate within that culture.
Okay, absolutely. Sure, good.
So let's move on a bit to there seems to be a growing movement amongst evangelicals towards this idea of social justice. And it seems to definitely be prevalent here as well. But maybe we can start with, what are your views on this movement? Do you even regard it as a movement in the first place? But what are your thoughts around it?
Yeah, so I've not entered into that fray a whole lot, and I think part of that is Canada and America are very different.
Right.
This issue seems to be centered in America, and I think that's just because that's where the center of evangelicalism right now is. Reformed evangelicalism. Yeah, there are Reformed Christians all around the world, but the center of it is in the U.S. And America has a distinct history, distinct issues. So I think we, in the rest of the world, have to interpret things a little bit. What in this discussion is distinctly American and depends upon their unique history with slavery, their unique history with Jim Crow, their unique history with the end of, the end. Let's talk about maybe the resolution of some of those issues in more recent American history and all of that. And so I find we have to do a lot of interpretation in Canada. And I expect you have to do the same. So when it comes to those issues and discussing them, I find that I just kind of like to stay back a little bit. So I have my viewpoints, but I'm very leery to speak into a conversation as a Canadian that will be heard by Americans through American ears. So maybe that's cowardice, maybe the rest of the world has something unique to offer the conversation. But yeah, I find you need to do that.
Okay, that's fair. There seems to be a lot of people putting their opinions out there who don't know anything about anything. And I think I don't know if that's just human nature or just the prideful side of humans to just want to have an opinion about everything. But this seems to be one of those things where everyone has their ideas and they're bringing them into the fold no matter.
And other people are demanding opinions of you. So if you don't really have a strong opinion, people see that as a mark of weakness.
Right.
But, it's like a lot of conversations. It's like a lot of conversations in that there's tons of talking and not a lot of listening.
Right.
But also that this is a relatively new idea, at least in this time. We've had a lot of people migrate to the Reformed tradition, and I think as these issues come upon us, it just takes time to sort through them. And so it's very easy to say social Marxism or something like that. And that may be true, but you just, as new ideas enter, you just have to sort of weigh them out. We see that in the discussion about complementarianism now. How do we put bounds on what it means to be a complementarian? So here's the core of what it means, and then here's the bigger circle of you can hold to these different things and still be complementarian. And then here's that, no, you're definitely outside. You can no longer consider yourself that. And I think with the social justice issue as well, we're still negotiating the parameters, and it's just going to take time. And people will make some mistakes and overstep and understep those boundaries. But if we're patient and kind and willing to just believe the best, hope all things about others, I think we'll be okay.
We have to pray for that to happen. This has caused a lot of people to become enemies, it seems.
If we gain the right perspective on that, but destroy the unity of the church, we're not that much farther ahead. So we need to hold fast to the truth, but always truth and love, those two things go together. And so if we can, again, just grant each other some grace to work this through, trusting that that guy loves the gospel and I love the gospel. We're seeing this differently right now.
Yeah.
Let's give it some time, let's discuss it, and we'll see how we emerge.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. And one specific, actually, social issue that I wanted to bring up to you. So, Zambia, abortion has been legal in this country at least since 1994. I'm not sure when.
1972.
1972 was when the act was signed. Right?
That's right, that's when
Yeah.
the act was signed.
1972 was when the act was signed. It's not really something that we've addressed, and I think it's because many people don't know. What has been the I guess response to the abortion issue in the Christian circles where you're from? Maybe some advice you would give us to think through.
Yeah. So in Canada, abortion is essentially neither legal nor illegal. There's no law about abortion. And so aborting a baby is like having a wart cut off your hand. The law doesn't speak to cutting off warts, it doesn't speak to killing a baby. And so again, in America, you have Roe v. Wade, everything that really codified the right to abortion. In Canada, we don't have that. And so one of the big movements among Christians is just, we need a law. Make it legal or illegal or something. Once we have a law, we can start going after that law, strengthening that law, or loosening that law, or whatever it is. In Canada, abortion is very, very prevalent. My mom was one of the early leaders in the anti-abortion movement in Canada as it became more prevalent, and really as one doctor really challenged the system. He wanted to do abortion, and so it went through the judicial system there and emerged that we won't have a law about abortion. But my mom was one of the early, fairly prominent in our area activists against abortion. So I was raised in that atmosphere, and remember my mom going out Saturday mornings to do her work and to picket and try and save babies. And then just recently I've been a board member of an organization that's committed to helping women through pregnancy. So it's an issue that's very near and dear to me. I guess advice would be patience. It takes a long, long time. And with so much messaging coming out of the Western world, if you will, that abortion is not only good, but it's necessary to be a good country, an admirable country. You have to have full right to abortion. You know, in Canada, we see aid being held back from countries that won't permit abortion. So it's considered such an essential human right that you're not even worthy of aid unless you permit it and endorse it. So it's very, very troubling. The other thing would be just confidence in I think the place to begin is in the Imago Dei, the image of God. Just nail down your doctrine of we are all created in the image of God. Here's what it means to be made in the image of God. And that image is not bestowed upon you the moment you emerge from your mother. That is, you are made in the image of God from conception. And then just the beauty of life. So there's so many movements that are so anti-life. A lot of the environmental movements now are anti-life. Stop having children, even down to just start killing off humanity to preserve the earth. And abortion, of course, anti-life, and so many others. So to celebrate the value of each life and to say God told us to be fruitful and multiply. He didn't say be fruitful and multiply until there are 7 billion people on the earth or something. He said be fruitful and multiply. So that's everybody's responsibility to continue to bring God's image bearers into this world and not heed the messaging of the world is so awful, the world is so horrible, we need to stop having babies. That's not to say everybody should have as many babies as they possibly can. It's a different issue, but just in general, humanity's calling from God is to create more humans. God loves people, God's image is in people, and so he wants there to be more people.
Amen. That's so good. I mean, that's a passion project for us here as well. We're trying to have our first, we haven't announced this publicly yet.
No, we haven't.
But anyway, we're trying to do some stuff, right, with regard to abortion, which is a serious issue in this country. But I think there's a lot of people who aren't aware about how big an issue it is. And so we really just want to cast a light on that and bring the gospel to bear on that situation. So we really appreciate you saying all that.
Yeah, abortion is an issue where euphemisms rule the day, and so you get to be pro-choice. You know, hold on a sec. And you know, they use even abortion. It's not abortion, it's murder, it's killing. And they talk about the pregnancy. We're going to remove that pregnancy from you, as if pregnancy is anything.
That's right.
So it's full of euphemisms, which is the way of getting around the issue. And then also just being able to speak about it frankly. You have to be able to. Everybody knows abortion goes on, and wherever there are people who are pregnant, there's knowledge of how to end that, terminate that pregnancy, and that will always happen as long as sinful humanity is around. But the officializing of it, the permitting of it by the country, and being able to push back against people's presuppositions about what pregnancy is and what abortion is very important.
That's good. I want to switch up gears a little bit, get into one of Reformed people's favorite topics, Calvinism.
All right.
So there's some layers I want to peel as we talk about this. But let's just start with what was it like when you first encountered the doctrines of grace? Yeah.
Well, I encountered them as a child, so they're all I've ever known.
Sure.
Except for that brief period of time, I think we talked about, where I drifted away from them.
Yeah.
But no, from the very beginning of my days, I was memorizing the Westminster Shorter Catechism, chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. That sounds like Calvinism.
Sure.
And the Heidelberg Catechism,
Right.
what is your only comfort in life and death?
Sure.
And that I'm not my own, but one in body and soul in life and death, my faithful Savior Jesus Christ. Like, again, this was the water I was swimming in as a child.
That's really great. So getting into perhaps a more relevant issue, especially in our context, the term New Calvinism has sort of become a term of controversy. Perhaps several assumptions and misunderstandings about what it is. And I know this is something that you've spoken about as well. You made a great feature in the Calvinist movie, which was great. I really enjoyed watching that. But yeah, what's your take on New Calvinism? What is it? Is it something to be wary of? Is it, what is it? Yeah.
It's a good question, and I think it's changed over the years. Really, my desire is that New Calvinists become, let's call them Old Calvinists, because New Calvinism was essentially people emerging from the wider Christian world, adopting between 4 and 5 points of Calvinistic theology, just kind of wanting a big God theology instead of the little God theology that a lot of people brought out of very pragmatic or prosperity gospel backgrounds. And so they encountered Reformed theology, and they largely did it through Piper, Washer, or something like that. Generally, they were brought in by some big name, and they just wanted this big God. But what they haven't done, and still I think largely haven't done, is dive into the Reformed tradition.
Sure.
So when you become a Reformed Christian, you're not starting out. You're joining into this tradition that's existed for a long time, and I think you're responsible to join into that tradition, to research your roots, which means you got to get in touch with the confessions, you got to get in touch with the creeds, you got to get in touch with the catechisms and all this good stuff. So that's where I think the New Calvinism needs to keep striving. It's not enough to be essentially a pragmatic Christian with some Reformed theology overlaid. You got a whole tradition. So your starting point when social justice comes along is not, you're not starting from nothing. Your first thing should be, well, what does the tradition say about this? What does the London Baptist Confession? It might say nothing, but at least that's where we go first. Or the Westminster Confession if you're Presbyterian. What do these things say about that? They might have already addressed this. Now I can take that as my starting point, thinking greater minds than I have already been there and started to lay down the foundation. Now I just see, well, how do I live out that in the 21st century?
Absolutely. I think that's very clear. I've really appreciated people wanting to be more defined in their faith, aligning yourself to a confession, being familiar with creeds. I think that's been very important. But I think in this controversy here, it's sort of like everyone's been painted with one brush. So perhaps the most, for lack of a better term, the most immature New Calvinist would become the poster boy for all New Calvinists, And I think perhaps that's where a lot of the misunderstandings have taken place. I mean, for example, Driscoll sort of became the poster boy for New Calvinism,
Yeah.
And, it's like, no, not everyone is a Driscoll.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah,
And
so.
that broad stroke, I guess one of the issues I've had with New Calvinism has been, and maybe this is just me, but I feel like I don't know how to differentiate who is being considered a New Calvinist and who is being considered an actual Calvinist or whichever terms. Because like you put John MacArthur in the same boat as Driscoll, in the same boat as Piper, and they're just all the same.
Yeah. So I think part of the issue is just nomenclature. Like I would say New Calvinism is a movement or something, but the people are Calvinists.
Right.
So they joined into a new version of it, or just like really, if you go back to the original Time magazine article,
Sure.
it was really just about Calvinism is back. And so the new Calvinists were just people who were discovering it for the first time. So Calvinism wasn't new, but the people were new to it. And so I don't think we need to say he's an old Calvinist, he's a new Calvinist.
Sure.
Now some I think maybe old school Calvinists would disagree, so some that truly reformed, they refer to themselves as, they would disagree, but I think largely we can say that Reformed, Calvinist, we kind of use those terms interchangeably, and it's just really whoever holds to those doctrines of God's sovereign saving grace is part of that movement. But the question, so one of my concerns with it is for a while now it's been trendy. We've had the Bodie Bauchams of the world, just good guys that people are excited to listen to, Paul Washer, John Piper, these guys. Are people really becoming reformed in their theology, or are they just kind of riding the wave? And when it's no longer cool, and I think this is already happening, when it's no longer cool to be associated with this thing, will those people stick around? Or are they just going to move to the next thing, whatever the next thing is? Because a lot of people went from fundamentalism into pragmatic, purpose-driven type church, and then they migrated again to Calvinism. That shows they're not putting down firm roots in any of these movements. So that's again, we got to keep pushing people, put down deep roots. Don't let yourself just be like a 4-point Calvinism who's never read a confession, never read a catechism. Dive into the tradition, ground yourself, root yourself. And then when the next thing comes along, you won't go. You'll stay fixed on these firm doctrines.
Quick one, Tim. What do you love most about Reformed theology?
I think it's true. I don't know how to understand God apart from Reformed theology. I don't know how to understand the Christian faith apart from Reformed theology. I tried, and it was unsatisfying. In my perspective, it was just too weak. It just didn't ring true in my mind. So I just think it describes the truth.
Absolutely. Good. Thank you so much, Tim. I mean, it's been great to have you today. Just how can we be praying for you?
Yeah, prayer. A big one for me is health. My hands are not working very well anymore. I'm getting tons of pain in my hands, which means I can't type much anymore. So I'm asking people to pray about that, and if that's the way God wants it to be, I'm okay with that. But I'd really like to be able to sit down and type all day, like in the good old days. So that would be really nice. Other than that, just wisdom and safety through speaking and travel and ministry would be wonderful. We've all seen good guys fall apart and go down, and I don't think any of them were expecting to. I think they all thought they were doing okay and were, asking for prayer and all that. It's just stay true, and at the end of it, to be able to hear "well done" and not have some huge, horrible situation in my background. So
it's great.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tim. This has been great.
Next time we're here, let's do this again.
All right,
for sure.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks again, Tim. That said, I'm Moose.
And I'm Lenny.
And we are
Unapologetic.